good morning, everybody. I want to welcome you and thanking you for taking time out of your busy schedule for this webcast, this joint webcast, on disability policy here in Japan, the past, the present, and the future. And I'm very excited, about this event. I'm very excited about our speaker, Mark Bookman. Now, before we get going, there's a couple of sort of housekeeping things that we're going to have to go through. Please note that the session is on the record, that your microphone is going to be muted. We do want to have interaction, and we invite your comments and questions throughout the webinar. So please use the Q&A box on your screen there. We'll take it from there. We'll have a good session. Please don't be shy. Do ask the questions, and we'll weave them in here. And now I'd like to get going. Switch it over to our speaker, Mark Bookman. You will have had a chance to have looked at his, CV there. Mark's is just in the final stages of completing a Ph.D. Is now at Tokyo University and here in Japan. And I don't think there's anybody better to give us, an outlook and an outline of disability policy here in Japan. Mark, why don't you take it away?
Sure. Well, first, let me just say that, Jesper, thank you very much for the kind introduction, and thank you, everyone, for coming today. So I'm going to speak a little bit about disability policy in Japan, the past, present, and future. But essentially, my goal here today is to explain this photo to you. How is it that in a country where roughly 1 in 9 people has a disability or a chronic illness, where around 30% of the population is over the age of 65, when the Olympics are coming next year, we end up building bridges that are accessible or claim to be accessible, but look like this. I can say, as a wheelchair user myself, my chair would definitely fall off the edge of this bridge, and I'd find myself in the water before too long. So I'm going to be talking about what is the history behind the policy that allows stuff like this to get built? And what can we do to make a more inclusive society? And I'll argue that society is not just Japan as an island or as a region, but a global society. Anyway, to explain this image, we actually kind of have to go far back. I'm going to start here with the end of World War II. So when Japan loses World War II, there are a number of consequences. One of them is that there are a ton of wounded veterans who are coming back from the battlefield in the front lines that need welfare and care. But unfortunately, because Japan's lost the war, there's a problem in providing that care. If the government was to give welfare policies specifically for veterans, there was the concern that the Allied powers might have an issue with Japan supposedly remilitarizing. So they had to create welfare, but they couldn't give it specifically to veterans, and they had to make it in a way that appeared to appeal to the democratizing and equalitizing rhetoric of the moment. So the first thing that policymakers tried to do was to create welfare for the poor, broadly speaking. We're going to give a little bit of money and a little bit of services out to everyone. But the problem was that there were just way too many poor people in Japan after World War II. So that policy really didn't hold. Then they said, well, okay, if poor people is too broad a category, why don't we focus on disability? And it's actually in 1949 when Japan gets its first disability law by name, that is a law that uses the category of shogai. So we see it's designed to help a small group of people namely this group of veterans and also some other disabled people who happen to fall into the category. But there's not a ton of money for it. It's a very small category. But that really starts to change in the 1950s and 1960s when Japan enters its so-called economic miracle. So this is a big wave of industrialization and urbanization that comes with changing economic policy. And we see all types of new developments. There are cars, but with cars, there are car accidents and people who are injured in them. There are new train stations, but of course, there are stairs and other barriers that prevent people with mobility impairments and other disabilities from using those trains. There's new factories and new jobs, but with them, pollution, new sources of impairment, and new kinds of illnesses. And while there are medical advances and people are living longer, that's also another cause of disability as old age comes with illness. So the number of disabled people in Japan rapidly increases in the 50s and 60s. And policymakers do their best to increase the budget to create various healthcare systems that would support people with disabilities at this time. But at the end of the day, the economy is still just now getting off its feet, and it's very tough to fund a lot of these programs. So you end up with a lot of sort of factory-made, not customized, not necessarily all that useful technologies and services for disabled people. And this really becomes apparent at the 1964 Olympic and Paralympic Games, which were held in Tokyo. When you have side by side a Japanese wheelchair that is made, at a factory, doesn't necessarily fit the user's body, and you have that next to a very highly customized chair from, say, the United States or Europe, it's very clear the differences that are going on in welfare between the two countries, or two regions, I should say. And part of those differences, they're so apparent, I should say, that the Crown Prince himself makes a comment and says, gee, welfare is really going well abroad, isn't it? With the implication that it's not necessarily doing so well in Japan. So policymakers start working to correct or find a way to deal with this growing population of disabled people. One of the solutions they come up with in the late 60s and early 1970s is to build large-scale colonies, institutions, facilities that are able to accommodate disabled people in large numbers and sort of maximize the amount of care and funding given for the population. The problem is that as the Japanese cities are booming, these facilities tend to get built outside of town where land is cheaper. And part of that means that supervision is a lot tougher. If you can't get the families, the friends, the government officials out to view these facilities, it's very tough to see what happens. And when you are putting more and more disabled people into a small, underfunded place, abuses can run rampant. So we see in the late 60s, early 70s, tons of reports of institutional abuse, whether it's physical, sexual, verbal, other kinds of issues arising at these disability institutions. So parents of disabled children and disabled people in general essentially have two choices. They can choose to either go to these institutions and risk abuse, or to stay at home and then not really be able to go outside or use the surrounding environment because it's not designed to accommodate them. And faced with this sort of difficult decision, we see a lot of cases of infanticide of disabled children. We see issues of new abortion policies being raised about whether it's okay to abort a fetus because it may have a significant disability. We see there's a lot of discussion about the bioethics of how disability should be treated in the early 70s. And it's in response to these debates and incidents of infanticide and what have you that some disability groups start forming and speaking out. So throughout the 70s, we have One group in particular comes to mind, the Green Grass Society, Aoshiba no Kai in Japanese, that is a group of people with cerebral palsy and related disabilities who come together and start lobbying politicians for everything from increased access to public transit to laws that would benefit them in education. The one incident that comes to mind, if you look at the photo I have on the right here, a group of individuals from that organization actually held up a bus station in Kawasaki in 1977 and stopped traffic for around 150,000 people in the greater Tokyo area in an effort to protest the inaccessible transit there and show that the outside community had to change. These protests, while they were visible, they were not necessarily that big and they were not necessarily that well coordinated amongst different groups of disabled people. They were still relatively focused. But that began to change in 1981 when the UN hosted the International Year of Persons with Disabilities. This year essentially provided a milestone moment where activists from across the world, whether it was the US, the UK, Germany, other places, were able to exchange information freely by traveling to each other's countries. So we saw a bunch of American and European disability activists coming to Japan to talk about welfare abroad, and a bunch of Japanese activists traveling to the United States and elsewhere to learn about disability and welfare abroad. These exchanges brought in all types of new information and new ways of thinking about how disability welfare might be constructed in Japan. So one thing we saw in the mid-1980s was the rise of independent living centers, or Jiretseikatsenta in Japan. And those centers provided services like caregiving, home remodeling, transportation assistance, services that would allow disabled people to live in their communities as opposed to being sheltered in institutions and running into the problems that would be encountered there. So these services really started the conversation about how to get people out in the community. And once disabled people were able to get around to some extent, they were able to form new alliances and work on policies in new ways. One of the most important alliances was with groups representing the aging population in the late 80s and 90s. And by that point in time, Japan's population of the elderly had been rising steadily for around 20 years. Certainly after the bubble crash in the early 90s, we had a large after the bubble crash, we had this very visible population of elderly people in need of care. And as a result of that, the disabled populations ended up being able to work with them and push for access policies. And one of the ways that they did this was to host these very large-scale demonstrations in the interest of achieving access for everyone. So at the heart of these different initiatives was an idea called universal design. And universal design was essentially, we're going to create access for everyone, whether it's the international activists coming from abroad, whether it's the aged population coming domestically, whether it's the disabled activists who've been pushing for policy reform in education, transportation, welfare for various sectors for many years. We're going to push all of this stuff together and try and create a system that's easily accessible and usable by as many people as possible. With this push for universal design, there's enough people and enough support that we're able to pass Japan's first compulsory transportation law in 2000. Under this law, public transit, trains, buses, for instance, are required to become accessible for persons with disabilities. But part of that is that Japan rapidly has to rebuild its infrastructure to accommodate a lot of these populations. So if you're installing elevators and ramps and other parts of barrier-free architecture at a rapid pace, you're going to run into problems. And the problems are that everything is delayed or displaced. And what I mean by that is that elevators get built at the far ends of train stations so as to not disturb the traffic that comes through every day. People being train attendants, have to supply ramps for disabled people because the trains were not built to accommodate them. That takes time and energy to get the ramp from the station desk to the train and then have the wheelchair user get on board. So a lot of the accessibility that gets built, even though it's now designed with everyone in mind, it takes a lot of time and a lot of effort to get going. So it's very slow building. We see another universal design law in 2006 that shows some of the other problems besides time delays and difficulty implementing accessibility policy. So this is the Independent Support Act for Persons with Disabilities. And essentially, the act dictates that we're going to create welfare services for everyone with a disability at a 10% deductible. But there's a problem when you charge everyone 10% for their services. I've got two photos of myself here, around 10 years apart. And what you find is that, I was disabled in both instances. But when I had a relatively light disability in the photo on the left, I was able to get around relatively easily. I was able to work relatively easily. I was not spending a lot of money for my services, and I was able to pay that money relatively easily because I didn't need a lot. Compare that to where I am now as a wheelchair user who uses caregivers and ventilators and different types of medical equipment. My expenses are a lot more, and arguably it's a lot harder for me to get a job because I have a more serious disability. So the flat 10% rate actually punishes people with more severe disabilities, and this becomes a major problem. Disability activists in the late 2000s start speaking out and saying we need to create a society that's fair for everyone, that doesn't lead people with more serious disabilities to get discriminated against, where the policies we make, because they're trying to accommodate everyone, don't accidentally overlook certain populations. How do we make sure that we're not accommodating just the elderly or just people with certain disabilities? This becomes the shift of the conversation. So appealing to things like the United Nations Convention on the Rights of Persons with Disabilities, which comes out in 2006, or a very sort of visible moment, which is 3/11, when the tsunami and earthquake happened in Japan. We have many disabled populations that, because the environment is not built to accommodate them, they are unable to escape early on, and afterwards are unable to get supplies they need to survive. Just to give you an idea, around 25% of all post 3/11 deaths are attributed to disabled people. So there's this very visible moment of disability accommodation not being sufficient. There's a push from the outside with the UN to make human disability rights more prevalent in Japan. By appealing to all these simultaneous events that are happening in the late 2000s, we finally get to a law built to eliminate discrimination against persons with disabilities in 2013. It's implemented 3 years later in 2016. But just because you have a law that says that we're going to eliminate discrimination, that doesn't necessarily mean that that law is going to translate into practice all that well. And this is one of the problems that we've seen, and one of the main points I want to focus on today. Where did you start eliminating discrimination against persons with disabilities? Do you start by working on education? Do you work on employment? Do you work on transportation? Do you work on healthcare? Do you work on the confluence of these issues? Figuring out where we begin is a very important first step, and it's one there hasn't been a lot of time to discuss. At the end of the day, we're talking about a policy that was officially implemented 4 years ago. And let me explain to you why this can become an issue so fast. I'll talk about myself here. When I get up in the morning, I have to use help from a caregiver to sit up in bed. And then I have to have the caregiver help transfer me into a wheelchair that an engineer has to design. I have to drive across my apartment that an architect built barrier-free. I have to use my modified shower, which a medical equipment specialist put together. I have to follow the tactile pavement, or tenjibyoku, from my house to a train station. I use my government-issued disability pass that a policymaker had to prepare for me to get on the train. The attendant helps me with the slope. An educator helps me once I get to school. I go to work and talk with my boss and colleagues about how I can fit my wheelchair into the space. And there are so many other people I rely on a daily basis. If any one of these people was not there, in other words, if the caregiver wasn't there in the morning, or the engineer had not designed my wheelchair, or the architect didn't build my apartment the right way, then I wouldn't be able to do anything else on this list. The entire thing falls apart. So when we talk about anti-discrimination, you can't just build it in one sphere. It can't be just the caregiver or just the engineer. And even if it's all these spheres, they all have to connect. So that's the big question, is how do we bring everyone together? That's what I really want us to focus on for the moment. How do we create anti-discrimination that brings together every sector of society? Because if we don't, we end up with this. We end up with someone who, and this is an example from Nagoya Castle. They're currently planning on taking the elevator out of the castle. And the solution was, let's build stair climbing robots to carry the elderly and disabled upstairs. I mean, I don't know about other people. I'll speak for myself and say there's no way I'm getting into that chair. I certainly don't trust it to carry me up flights of stairs. Part of the problem is that the engineers working on the project didn't consult people with disabilities or anyone else in other specialties when designing these technologies, or certainly didn't consult them as much as they could have, which might have produced a product that integrated more in terms of usability. It's the same logic that brings us back to the bridge that I started with earlier on. This is something that was clearly designed well-intentioned, designed to eliminate discrimination, designed to help people. But who was involved in its construction? Well, chances are it was put together pretty fast. It might have been an architect, it might have been an engineer, but I'm willing to bet they didn't ask a wheelchair user when they were designing this. These issues are just becoming more prevalent. With all the barriers that are showing up right now, especially in the middle of Corona-19, people's lives are at risk. If you can't get outside and you can't get masks, or you can't get food because the environment is not designed to accommodate you, or it takes you longer because you're waiting for a ramp for a train, and that delay exposes you to the coronavirus, that's a huge issue. And it's going to become a bigger issue as the population continues to age in Japan, as we have more people who are disabled and more people who are exposed to these issues. Indeed, it's not just Japan. Let's think about the Olympics for a minute. The Olympics are going to be this moment when people from across the world come to Japan, see what Japan is doing in terms of accessibility, take that back to their own cultures, and rebuild their own infrastructures. What is Japan's policy for disability going to do to reshape the world? If it's not sufficient for us right now, it could create problems. So we have to think as a group about how to reimagine Japan's accessibility right now, how to bring people together, how to have specialists in multiple disciplines working to enact that anti-discrimination policy that finally became possible after decades of protest in the early 2010s. So that's what I want to talk about today when we break into the Q&A. What is our role in making sure we can create an effective anti-discrimination policy that helps create a truly inclusive, accessible, global society? Thank you.
Mark, thank you very much for these fascinating remarks and very much to the point here. If I may kick off the discussion, and please, people in the audience, please don't be shy. Please do put your questions up there. Mark and I will be able to see and respond to that. Mark, there's one area I'd like you to elaborate a little bit on, perhaps, which is, obviously, we need to change the mindset. It needs to be a mindset of inclusion. I think your example of the supposed barrier-free new access to the Nagoya Castle without any, disabled people actually being consulted, that's certainly very shocking. But what about the workspace? What do you see? I mean, obviously, integration, there is what you call the puzzle of life that needs to be solved. But at the end of the day, it is about inclusion and integration, in the workplace. Can you comment a little bit about your experiences, perhaps, and then sort of elaborate of some of the things in terms of inclusion in the workspace that you see here in Japan?
Sure, I'd be happy to. So I think that there are two types of inclusion that tend to fall into the conversation for me anyway. The first is a retroactive accommodation or a retroactive inclusion, where we are now aware that we have to include disabled people. So when I go to my workplace at a university, for instance, I'll have people ask me, Mark, what can we do to make this space more inclusive for you? If we pull this desk out of the way, would that help you get around? And it's those type of conversations that, yes, it does help. It's important to be able to remodel what's already there. But I think the most productive conversations that I've had have been ones with places that are bringing disabled people in from the start. Before we even get to the retroactive building, let's design an entirely new space where disabled people and non-disabled people can work together and think about how to magnify the strengths of both. So how is it that we can use the disabled population's knowledge and skill set to rebuild the accessible working place or rebuild the non-disabled working place? The best example I could think of off the top of my head is actually what we're doing right now. Remote education and telework. Right now, the sort of two big buzzwords with Corona going on.
Yeah.
These have both been fields that disabled people have been working in for 20 years, 30 years, because at the end of the day, a lot of people can't leave their houses. They can't leave their hospitals. So they have the experience and they have the knowledge and they have the resources that could really help non-disabled populations. And it's important to think about how to leverage that in a way that will redesign the workplace that helps in a way that helps everyone. So I think those conversations are starting to happen, certainly in the venues around me. And I think that it's important that we create the spaces in all of our workplace venues to have those conversations take place.
Yeah, wonderful. And I think you make a very important point. I mean, certainly with the pandemic, in one way, we're all disabled now, and we've got to reinvent, a new way of interacting with each other and of working with each other. Mark, we've got a question from Harumi Kachi, and the question is sort of, historically, the development of, accessibility and integration policies, has Japan been lagging behind the United States or some of the other countries? I mean, how does Japan fare in an international comparison in terms of disability policy?
So this is one of the questions that I'm often asked, and there are two answers I'm going to give, which may or may not contradict each other, so we'll find out. But the first one is, I think it's never which country is more ahead. It's which country is more ahead for whom. So I'll give you an example here. As a American wheelchair user, when I come to Japan, my wheelchair is way too big for any wheelchair accessible thing. So when I go to use a universally designed toilet, my chair is not at the right height. It's too tall. And I cannot use those toilets even though they are supposedly wheelchair accessible. Now, someone from Japan who goes to the US would have the same exact problem, but in reverse. All the toilets will be too tall because their chairs are built smaller. So it's not that the US is better in terms of its access, it's that its target is different. Now, having said that, there are measures you can use to say that some areas are moving at a different pace in the US, for instance, than they are in Japan. There are some areas, specifically in architecture, that come to mind that are lagging. So, for instance, Japan's current rate of accessible hotel rooms around the country is around 0.4%. That's a national survey in 2018. That 0.4% is closer to, I believe, 6 or 7% in the US. We could look at similar statistics for the rate of disabled students who go to colleges and universities, for instance. The number's higher in the US. But there are many considerations that I think have to be taken into account here. How people are diagnosed as disabled, what legal infrastructures exist for them. I don't think that Japan is necessarily behind in its policy. I just think that its policy could be more inclusive and designed in a way that accommodates a broader group of individuals. For example, foreigners like myself who use large wheelchairs. And the US could do the same, mind you. But I think that's really the next step, is to think about how do we broaden the targets of our accessibility, and how do we figure out who needs access in the first place?
Fantastic. We've got a couple of more questions. One from Min Ku. Thank you, Min, for asking the question. And the question is, about the various types of disability and inclusion. You've obviously got physical disabilities, and then you've got mental disabilities. Can you speak a little bit about, how, the Japanese government categorizes that? Are they all lumped together, or is there a differentiated policy of the different types of disability, particularly physical versus mental disabilities?
There is differential policy for physical versus intellectual and developmental disabilities. Those policies play out in different ways. And but even though they play out in different ways, we can imagine similar results. So let me give you an example here. I spoke a lot today about physical accessibility and how, for instance, the needs of someone with a more severe disability may not be the same as someone with a lighter disability. Or put another way, the needs of an 82-year-old man might not be the same as a 29-year-old, person like myself. So there are all these differences in need at the physical level. The same spectrum can be imagined and is in place at the intellectual and developmental levels. It's always a matter of figuring out how much accommodation we can give to people who operate on a different wavelengths or in a neurodiverse category, for instance. What types of accommodations are in place for them? Part of it is that the policy will dictate we need to be reasonable in our accommodation, but then what counts as reasonable and how that's applied is a matter of the institution that's working on it. So whether it's the individual company, the individual school, there is a degree of negotiation of how much accommodation gets done. So we can imagine a very similar spectrum for intellectual or developmental disabilities, for instance, as we see with physical ones.
Right. Excellent. We have a question from Heike We've got the Paralympics, hopefully next year, and there's obviously a lot of momentum building around the Paralympic event there. Is there sort of anything, if you, I understand you're part of, some of the people who give some advice to the government there, for specifically in preparation for the Paralympics there, sort of any specific policies, any specific actions that you personally, think should be taken and should be paid greater attention to?
I think the number one thing we have to do at the moment is crowdsource. We have to gather as much information as possible about what access needs are out there and use the games as an excuse to do that. Imagine for a minute if everyone coming over for the games was able to report into a database what barriers they run into, or what their needs were. What could we do with that information in terms of rebuilding Japan? And indeed, let's say we come up with a bunch of beneficial things. They see that, Japan is doing really well in terms of its implementation of tactile pavement, tenjiboku on the street for people with visual impairments. If they see that and they report that, then other countries might be able to use that information positively. So, I mentioned earlier the sort of global exchange that the Olympics represent. Yeah. If we can find a way of harnessing that exchange to generate knowledge, that is the best use of the games, in my opinion, because for the next 10, 20, 30, however many years, the aging population and the growing disabled population will benefit from that knowledge. Yep. So I think in terms of the Paralympic policies, yes, the access initiatives that are going on right now in terms of rebuilding the barrier-free environment are important. But I think the knowledge initiatives, the sharing information initiatives are really what's going to be key to keep that going after the games.
I think, Mark, you make an absolutely key point. I mean, the crowdsourcing, of ideas and of little observations that can be aggregated there. In fact, one of the organizations that is involved in this putting together this webcast is Hands on Tokyo and the Lives Initiative, and they are engaging now in a mapping project, where you actually have all over the world, starting at universities and at schools, mapping out the little hints and tricks for navigating for a disabled person, for navigating through any of the cities there. So that's a very exciting project, where you see actually grounds up resources, being used to aggregate for the overall better good. There's a question from Akira Hoshino. Hoshino-san is asking about this law that is mandating, for corporations of a certain size to hire a certain number of people with disabilities. Can you speak a little bit about that and perhaps also put that in context, whether these sort of laws exist in the United States and in other countries?
So the hiring quotas we see in Japan are fairly unique. And the efficacy of them is a little bit suspect from my end of things. I'll give you an example that comes to mind that makes me question those laws. So I believe it was in 2018 it came out that the government had been misreporting its own employment statistics of persons with disabilities for around 40 years, and conflating numbers with people who may have been dead. It was a fairly big scandal. And I think the issue with quotas is one of classification. Who really counts to fit into that number, and how do you figure that out? Is it a medical diagnosis? Well, medical diagnoses don't capture all forms of bodily or mental diversity, so that doesn't seem like a great solution necessarily. I think there are problems with the quota system. That doesn't mean that it doesn't have its own virtues as well. I appreciate that it does bring disabled people into the workplace and start conversations about diversity. But I think that there are other ways of doing that. And I think I won't say that the U.S. has been more effective. I don't think that they have been. But I think that by starting the conversation with accessibility, by starting it with let's create a workplace where people can get in the front door to tell us what the other barriers are, that's the necessary first step, is to create the room for conversations. And I don't know if quotas do that. I think that initial access initiatives, even if they're not 100% effective, if they're 50% effective, and you can have disabled people point out the other 50%, then that's the way that we need to be thinking. So I would say the quota system is important, but it only matters if we have an environment that's already hospitable, already accommodating. And I do want to touch on one more thing here connected to it, which is that even if you have jobs that are quota mandated, can you make, or are there enough people who are qualified to do those jobs is another question. Do disabled people have access to the education, access to the skills that they would need to be able to fill those positions? Well, in Japan, reasonable accommodation in universities was not a legal requirement until 2016. So we're talking about there's not enough people in the pipeline to fill the jobs, even if they're mandated. That's one of the problems.
Yeah, no, you make a very, very important point. I mean, I think certainly the spirit of of the quota is pointing in the right direction, but in the Gemba, in the reality, there's a lot of issues that are out there. I mean, the dropout rates of people with disabilities, between high school and university, and then from university jobs to jobs, in Japan is actually quite horrendous, as you know. Now, there's a question, from Morikawa Noriko. Morikawa-san is asking, in Japan, there are now 2 people with disabilities in Japanese parliament. In the United States, for example, do you see, people with disabilities who are participating in government?
So I'll say a couple things about this. First, Japanese politicians with disabilities are not actually new. The first blind member of parliament entered in the early 1900s. I want to say like 1905, 1906. It was very early. Now, people with severe disabilities like Kimura Eiko and Funago Yasuko, the people who are in now, that is a new development. But even wheelchair users, the first wheelchair user entered in 1977. So there is a history of disabled participation in parliament. Having said that, I think that we are now at a moment, because of the Olympics, because of the aging population, because of this Japan ratifying the UN Convention, because of all this visibility that is now on disability, that the disabled members of parliament have a lot more power to push for access initiatives than anyone did before them. And I think that's also happening in the U.S., for instance. People like Senator Tammy Duckworth, who is disabled, are able to capitalize on the current moment to push for access initiatives that never would have passed in the past. Yep. So I think that a lot of the politicians with disabilities have a representative capacity that allows them to push for access policies and disability policies, but that push is only relevant insofar as it's related to the environment around them, socially and politically. And I think that we're at a good moment right now to have these global conversations about access, especially with stuff like Corona, people being denied access to basic supplies. It's a good time for disability policy.
No, I think you make a very important point. And as you know, in my home country, in Germany, actually the finance minister was, Mr. Stoible, there was an assassination attempt that fortunately he survived, but he had to be in a wheelchair. All the G7 meetings, so, all these things, they needed to be revamped, to provide the access there. But certainly I think it does raise the awareness. There's a question from Bob Norden which is sort of asking your personal opinion, in terms of the awareness of, diversity, the need for inclusion. If you just, compare and contrast a little bit, Japan versus the United States and versus Europe, how do you personally rate Japan?
So I think that there are some problems and some solutions with Japan right now. The problem is this. The law for the elimination of discrimination against persons with disabilities was passed in 2016. 1 year later, the Cabinet Office did a public opinion poll to ask about that law, and 77% of the public said they'd never heard of it.
Huh.
So that's an issue, right? And I think part of the problem really is if disabled people cannot get out of their houses, if they cannot get to an education, if they cannot get employment, they're not able to vocalize in those spaces about their needs, and everything becomes out of sight, out of mind. You don't know there's a problem until the problem is able to be called attention to. And that's one of the issues we see in Japan right now. But I also think that Japan, because of the aging population, because of the Olympics, there is this very large spectacle right now that is helping to eradicate some of those barriers at a very rapid pace. We're seeing awareness grow in ways that we don't see in the U.S. The U.S., the ADA, the Americans with Disabilities Act was passed 30 years ago. We don't see updates on that all that often in terms of awareness of the public. In fact, I would say that it's almost the case that it's very tough to provide developments and access in the U.S. because almost everything ends up becoming a lawsuit, which is time and energy and money and things that we don't necessarily have to fix a small barrier that may be an inconvenience as opposed to a life-threatening problem. For me, if I can't get into a restaurant because there's stairs, even if I know there should be a ramp, I'm probably not going to fight about it because by the time I'm done fighting, that ramp, the restaurant may be out of business. That's something that in Japan, it wouldn't necessarily happen the same way. Because there's this boom of awareness, even if there's not as much legal pressure to change, there's a lot more social pressure to change. So I think that Japan is actually progressing at a more rapid pace than a lot of other places are right now.
Yeah, which is interesting, right? Because, I think you're absolutely right. The fact that, now or in a couple of years, 1 in 3 people in Japan is going to be over the age of 70. And, obviously, whether it's mental diseases, whether it's physical disabilities, the older you get, the more, incapacitated, people become. And as a result of that, there is a self-serving need here, to reduce the barriers and to become inclusive. Now, the interesting thing is that, of course, and Mark, I know you've looked at the demographic statistics. Japan is just basically about a decade ahead of everybody else. This is something that's going to hit Europe, that's going to hit China, quite strongly as well. So again, I think that, here in Japan, this laboratory, also for disability policy, I think Japan, there's a lot of things that can be done to actually showcase, the good things that are going on. And I think, whether you're the leader of a multinational corporation here or the leader of your own company here, Japanese or multinational, I think there's a lot of things that we can help and do and showcase, actually coming forward. I had one other question, which was a bit more personal, Mark, sort of for parents, with children with disabilities. Is there any sort of advice that you would give the parents?
It's a very tough question. Honestly, it's a little bit out of my wheelhouse to talk about anything other than my personal experience in this regard. But I can say I had 2 very different parents. The way that I describe it, my mother was very much interested in keeping me alive. And what that meant was basically limiting a lot of my exposure to the outside world that may have been dangerous, that may have caused my personal muscular condition to get worse. making sure I take all the right medicines, go to the hospital as much as possible, find myself in situations where my life is sustained. Um, my father, on the other hand, if my mom was concerned with keeping me alive, he was concerned with letting me live. And what that meant was, even if it would be at risk to my personal health, putting me in a position where I could get exposure to new things, where I could have new experiences, where I could go out and travel across the world to Japan, for instance. It's not something that every disabled child gets an opportunity to do. So, with those two kind of backgrounds for me personally, seeing the benefit of both, the best advice I can give is think about the access environment around you and try and strike a balance between making sure that people are safe, but also ensuring that there's a quality of life, that we're able to enjoy what we're doing and have new experiences and talk about what it is to have a disability as well. I mean, one thing that I often see is that disability is masked as that thing you don't talk about or that thing that you try not to make too much of an issue because you want to some extent, normalize and make sure you can get through the system, to get the job, to get the schooling. But I think it's really important that we talk about disability as a reality and work with it instead of against it when we try and reimagine the spaces of everyday life, whether it's your kitchen table at home or the school you go to or, what comes beyond that. I think it's just important to start the conversation with disability instead of trying to stamp it out.
Yeah, I think the communication is obviously the key there, and you put it wonderfully. I mean, quality of life aspect is absolutely key, and that's where the issue of ultimately for all of us as members of society and as leaders of society, focusing on genuine inclusion. Because the interplay, between whether it's with a mentally challenged person or with a physically challenged person, the interplay, certainly, will create new ideas. There's a lot of room for growth, for both, the healthy part and the unhealthy part. Now, Mark, in this respect, there's a question from Higa-san. Can you comment a little bit about the people who are born with a disability versus the people who had an accident and are forced into a disability after having lived, a so-called normal life beforehand? Any comments on that?
A lot, actually. Especially because I kind of consider myself as falling into both categories. I mean, I was born with a muscle disease, but it's progressive. It gets worse over time, kind of like an ALS. So I've seen my body change in many ways over the years. When I was in high school, I was still walking. When I came to Japan for the first time, which was then, I didn't know anything about disability. I wasn't experiencing it. It wasn't on my mind. When I came back to Japan for the second time in college, I was using a manual wheelchair. And I went back to the same spaces, same bars, same anime shops, but one step up was enough to stop me from going in. So the experience was entirely different. Then when I came back for a third time to do my Fulbright after undergrad, I was in an electric wheelchair, which meant that people couldn't lift it. So that created even again, same space, entirely new experience. And I found that, over time, each of these different experiences that I've had coming back and forth has radically affected how I view the world. It's radically affected the type of barriers that I advocate to eliminate. I think that people who become disabled later in life have one perspective, which is they recognize that they weren't able to see barriers before, and now they can. And that jarring reframing of perspective can become a source of great knowledge, great advocacy, great power. I think people who are born disabled as well have their own unique perspective because they live it and breathe it every day, and they are used to some types of interactions from childhood that other people just simply can't imagine becoming disabled later in life. And I think it's so important that we leverage both knowledge bases, the knowledge base of being born disabled and becoming disabled later in life, when we think about accessibility. Because they're different, we need to think about them both when we think about inclusion. It can't be one or the other. So it's important to have those conversations as well.
Yeah, fantastic. Mark, there's one other question which goes about in your understanding is the financial to create barrier-free architecture in Japan. Do you think that the financial constraint is sort of a serious issue here in Japan or in the United States?
I think people misunderstand the economics of barrier-free and accessibility. I'll give you an example. Imagine a theme park, and the theme park has 40 rides. 38 of them are not accessible. And the reason is for every 100 people who go into the park, maybe one of them is disabled, and the math doesn't seem to work out. What that math misses is that disabled people don't come alone. They come with friends and family and other people who are also buying tickets to that park. And when they're inside the park, they're also going to be interacting with other people in the park. And that's going to affect their experience. So if you think about it that way, that one person is really more like 50 or 60 people. And if you don't build inclusively, you're missing out on all that business. So I think when people talk about the financial constraints of barrier-free, they're not necessarily doing all the math you need to do to think about how to make it work. And there also are cost-efficient solutions in a lot of cases that can be negotiated with the people who use those facilities. Get the disabled people involved in the design process so that you can come up with the most cost-efficient solution that will maximize that profit ratio. I think there are ways to do that effectively, and I think that they're not being explored as much as they should be in Japan or the US, frankly.
No, and you would have thought, Mark, that that's going to become more and more imperative, particularly here in Japan, given the rapid aging that is going on. So that, maybe not a theme park, but whether it's an onsen or whether it's, an art museum, that the need for barrier-free, for access, because of the aging is going to be propelled even further. Mark, this has been very, very fascinating, and I wish that we could go on, but we do want to end on time here. I want to thank, first of all, our audience. I hope that you found this useful. That there's plenty of ways to get engaged, to follow up. And specifically, the Hands-on Tokyo Lives initiative. Is very focused on, including and integrating, the life of physically and mentally challenged people here into Japanese society. Actually, Mark, is a big supporter and works with them. We've got at the Lives Hands-on Tokyo several initiatives going on that I think you'll find very exciting. And, I hope that you and your company can actually get engaged with. And that's also a good way to keep up the direct communication with Mark going forward, the hands-on Tokyo Lives initiatives there. I want to thank all our sponsors as well. I want to thank in particular the American Chamber of Commerce here in Japan, as well as the International House, as well as, of course, our friends from the Asia Society. Thank you very much for participating. I do hope that you will get engaged. And Mark, a very, very big thank you to you. Thank you.
Thank you very much.